To unpack this for us a bit more further, we're now joined by aviation analyst Guy Leitch, and he joins us via our video link. Guy, thank you so much for your time this evening here on SABC News. Let's start off here. What is your immediate reaction to the news coming out today with the termination of the SAA and Takatso consortium deal?
Yeah, hi, and nice to be with you. Well, I think with the benefit of 2020 hindsight, it was inevitable. The deal was actually probably pretty held below the waterline within 6 months of it having been announced. And my view actually is a little jaundiced on the whole thing. My view is that actually the government has been perpetrating something of a con job almost. It's been a massive red herring to allow them to get SAA going up on its feet again, pretending that, don't worry, we'll eventually sell it off to a private sector consortium. And I don't think they really ever had any intention to do that. The reason I say that, which I understand, it's quite a strong accusation, but government has really been unnecessarily slow on this whole deal. They've only done one thing after another rather than do all the steps simultaneously. And they've dragged it out and they've dragged it out. And then I think the last straw, the final straw, happened about last month when they announced that they had actually withdrawn the act that was going to repeal the entire SAA Act. And even then they still had another 18 months to 2 years worth of licenses to modify if they were going to do the Takatso deal. So my view is that the deal was never likely to happen. And I think that the reality is that the revaluation of the airline to a very plausible $6 million, rands, absolutely made a mockery of the original sale deal, which called basically for selling 51% of the airline for 51 rand. Yes, obviously there was an additional 3 billion rand to be paid in by the Takatso, but that could have been borrowed as just to cover operating expenses as and when it was required. There was no hard and fast dates that money was going to be raised, and indeed there were often questions asked as to whether Takatso even had the money to do that. So ultimately, as we look back at it now, it wasn't a surprise.
And would you say that it was doomed from the onset? And I ask this because, it was always shrouded in secrecy, and, the relevant documents that people wanted to know about this deal, really, we couldn't even get to those documents. Would you say that it was doomed from the onset?
Yes, and I think that we just saw what was already a fairly shaky proposition rapidly start falling apart. The wheels really fell off with the Competition Commission when they ruled against the participation in the Takatso consortium of Global Airways. Now, Global Airways was the other key leg of the deal because on the one hand, you have Harith Partners who are going to bring in the necessary finance, but the whole rationale for having Global Airways involved was that they would bring the necessary aviation skills and, for that matter, licenses and aircraft to the deal. That was ruled out by the Competition Commission. And incidentally, one of the interesting aspects of that is that Global Airways effectively owns Lift. And the ownership of Lift was seen to be the real problem as to why SAA was not, or rather Pravin Gordhan, was not going ahead or permitting the sale of Mango to go ahead. It'll be interesting to see what now happens with the Mango sale.
And essentially, what does this mean for SAA and its operations?
That's an extremely good question. The first thing that Pravin Gordhan has done is reassured the employees, all 5,000 or so of them now, that their jobs are secure. And indeed, I think that on balance, the one thing that has come out of it is that the jobs probably are more secure. The simple truth is that if you have an airline operated by a majority private sector ownership, then they are going to sweat the assets harder. They are going to minimize the costs of labor. They are going to, over time, probably reduce jobs as far as they can, just for the sake of being competitive. So now we see a reversion back to essentially SAA version 1, the bad old days where the government owned it completely. Profits weren't necessarily a clear objective at all, but rather they used the airline, or they saw the airline as a development tool, primarily as a vanity project to fly the flag, which is an absurd notion, by the way, but also to assist with the country's development, to be able to, for instance, develop skills, and even more usefully, to fly to destinations that the private sector might not consider taking on because they would not initially be economically profitable. These are reasons, good reasons, sound reasons to have a state-owned airline, but there need to be really two key provisos if you have a state-owned airline. And the first is that it mustn't steal from the poor to subsidize the rich by effectively running at a loss. And secondly, that it must operate on a level playing field. In other words, it can't get favoritism. And the SAA version 1 failed dismally on both of those scores.
What do you also make of the timing of, the termination of this deal? I mean, we do find ourselves firstly in an election year. At the same time, we just heard a couple of days ago that the Minister of Public Enterprises will be retiring. And at the same time, looking at, the legacy of, Pravin Gordhan, can we really link, these three things together, looking at his legacy and looking at him retiring, and at the same time that we are in an election year?
It's hard to join those dots. I would have thought that on balance, getting rid of the Takatso deal would be good for the ANC in an election year. They can say, look, we're holding on to the state assets. We're not giving them away. We're not selling the family silver, as the old phrase used to go. We are protecting jobs. We are flying the flags. So it probably, you're right. I think that there probably is some significance to the fact that this is an election year. But I think that the bigger picture was, quite frankly, that Minister Gordhan had got himself into a tremendous pickle. As I said, he'd been kicking this can down the road for 3 years, and people were just absolutely coming to disbelieve everything he'd said. At the same time, we had the former DG crying foul and saying that the whole deal was essentially crooked. That was never properly repudiated. So unfortunately, it does mean that he turned 75 and retires with an unfortunate bad smell about this whole deal still lingering around him.
Let's lastly just wrap it up quickly. Can SAA survive? We are told by the minister that, it can function for the next 12 to 18 months. But essentially, where we find ourselves, the state of the economy and Treasury not having money, can SAA survive?
That's the million-dollar question, and it probably is at least $1 million. Pravin Gordhan remains insistent that there won't be any further state government bailouts or even subsidies or guarantees for finance deals from the state. And he says the airline, if it needs to raise money, will have to do so by doing asset-backed finance on the basis of its property portfolio. That sounds like a bad idea because it's essentially mortgaging or hooking its property portfolio. And I need to point out that entire 6 billion rand currently ascribed to the property portfolio is worth just the cost of one Airbus A350. So it really doesn't go a long way these days. And yet SAA is caught in a pinch, in a vice grip between two problems. It's still, like SAA version 1 was, lacking capitalization. It desperately needs to be recapitalized. And secondly, and now even more so, it doesn't have a fleet. It had to hand most of its fleet back to the lessors during the business rescue process. It's managed to get a few of the aircraft back, but to do long haul flying, it's hopelessly undercapitalized, and it needs to get new aircraft. And I can't see it getting new aircraft or new skills in any time soon without the 3 billion rand that it was supposed to get from the Takatso deal.
Guy, thank you so much for your time and that analysis. That is Guy Leitch. He is an aviation analyst, giving us his insight there when it comes to the termination of the Takatso and SAA deal.